A door opens inside the US Embassy in Tokyo. 27th September 1945. Soft leather shoes on polished floor. A small entourage. Emperor Hirohito steps into a room he does not control. For decades, cameras kept their distance. Even palace photographers had rules. Never too close, never from the side, never capture the stoop. Opposite him, Douglas MacArthur doesn't bother with a tie, hands in pockets. Relaxed, a general who knows the room already belongs to him. Lieutenant Gaetano Fialace lifts a camera. The Emperor stands as if carved. MacArthur looms. Click. The first frame looks like a mistake. The Emperor's suit hangs wrong. The general looks casual to the edge of insolence. Japanese officials protest. This cannot be printed. It is printed. By dusk, the most powerful image of the occupation is moving through Tokyo. It reads like a caption you don't need to write. There is a new shogun now. The message is not subtle. The Americans will govern through law, yes, but first they will govern through theater. They will use the throne to shrink the throne. And here's the twist the picture can't tell you yet. The same authority that will write a constitution to forever renounce war will, under pressure, order a uniform back onto Japan's shoulders. Pacifist by law, armed by necessity. Why did the pacifists bring back soldiers? New Year's Day, 1946. Snow on tiled roofs. Radios warm up across the archipelago. The Emperor's voice, rarely heard, comes through with courtly diction. The words are careful, but the effect is blunt. The imperial line does not rest on divinity. No more manifest God. The man in the photograph becomes the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. If you only read the transcript, it feels like paperwork. If you lived it, it felt like a pressure valve opening. The war had been total. The surrender catastrophic. People were starving. Cities were ash. A single sentence from the chrysanthemum throne could make the future less terrifying. Hirohito begins to tour. He waves from train platforms and visits schools. Children in caps and mittens bow and shout. The imperial aura shrinks to human scale. And that is exactly the point. MacArthur and his staff know they can't erase the emperor without setting the whole country on edge. They also know the imperial aura, staged correctly, can sell reform to people who didn't ask for it. So the occupation does two things at once. It breaks the theology while keeping the pageantry. As critics framed it, the once divine sovereign was recast as a national symbol, almost mascot-like. A camera did some of the work. A microphone finishes it. This is deliberate political messaging. It is also effective. By the end of January, most people understand. The emperor stays, but not as commander. The symbol will stand behind a different kind of power. Ballots, courts, and the blunt language of a new constitution. April 10th, 1946. A line of umbrellas outside a school gym in Tokyo. A clerk reads names. Women step forward. Some wear their Sunday best. Some carry toddlers on their hips. They mark their ballots and drop them into the box. 39 women win seats. From 0 to 39 in a day. The hush of paper on paper sounds like an era turning. Backstage, the drafting team races a calendar. Inside SCAP headquarters, the government section has just over a week in February to write a model constitution. Charles Cades and his team work through nights. Beate Sirota Gordon, a young linguist fluent in Japanese, pushes language on women's equality into the draft. Rights to choose spouses, own property, inherit, divorce. MacArthur insists on 3 principles, and one will echo for generations. Japan must renounce war as a sovereign right. The Japanese cabinet receives the draft and resists. SCAP applies pressure. The choice is presented as binary. Accept this framework or risk the emperor's removal. By March, compromise is reached. The document is refined, debated in the Diet, and promulgated on November 3, 1946. It takes effect on May 3, 1947. The language shocks and reassures at the same time. Sovereignty rests with the people. The cabinet, not a sacred throne, governs. The courts are independent. Local governments gain teeth. And then, Article 9. In words so plain you can read them over dinner, Japan forever renounces war and will not maintain land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential. Not a suggestion, a prohibition you can put on a classroom wall. For a nation that spent 15 years at war, the sentence feels like a cold cloth on a fever. Keep a spotlight on Beate Sirota Gordon. Japanese women, who just voted for the first time, now have equal rights under the law. You can argue about sovereignty later. In this moment, it is oxygen. Meanwhile, the emperor waves from rural platforms. The photo did the shock. The constitution does the structure. Together, they rewrite who gets to decide. The hardware of parliamentary democracy is now installed. The question is whether the old machine that fed it, the fat cables of military, bureaucracy, and business, can be cut. Democracy needs more than a ballot. It needs someone to lose power. Start in a village hall. A kerosene lamp. 3 men in work coats. A woman with calloused hands. They sign papers that say something extraordinary. The fields they rented for generations are now theirs. Between 1946 and 1949, the government acquires nearly 2 million hectares of cultivated land, close to 5 million acres, and resells almost all of it to the people who work it. The share of tenant-farmed land collapses from nearly half to about 1 in 10. If you grew up handing half your rice to a landlord, this is a revolution you can put on your kitchen shelf. The architect behind much of this is Wolf Ladajinski, a US advisor who knows the arithmetic of rural power. Land reform isn't just equitable, it's stabilizing. Owners don't riot like renters do. Now move to Tokyo boardrooms. The holding company liquidation commission begins unwinding the zaibatsu, the giant conglomerates whose family webs and bank ties wrapped around heavy industry, shipping, and finance. In one session, a Mitsui executive sits across from commission officials. His family controlled trading houses, mines, banks for generations. The officials place documents on the table, shareholdings to transfer, subsidiaries to spin off, cross-ownership to sever. The executive argues precedent, tradition, efficiency. The officials reply with a single reference, the Antimonopoly Act of 1947. Direct control dissolves. The Big Four, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Yasuda, no longer hold the economy's steering wheel. A period jingle mocked the big combines. The gist was clear. Public sentiment had turned. The occupation believes concentrated power was gasoline on the militarist fire. Break the trusts, break the risk. At the same time, censorship. The Civil Censorship Detachment rolls out a press code in September 1945. Newspapers can't criticize the occupation or run stories that might disturb public tranquility. Mail and movies are screened. Democracy is the goal, stability the prerequisite. Hear the tension? That's the late 1940s clicking from ideal to compromise. Outside offices and village halls, the streets are hungry. May 1946. Crowds swell to 200,000 near the Imperial Palace for Food May Day. Communist leader Tokuda Kyuichi faces the microphone. "We are starving." He turns and points toward the palace. "Is he?" A shot across the bow. The left is rising. Within a few years, the occupation will decide it's risen far enough. Land in the hands of farmers. Monopolies cracked. Ballots counted. The emperor's voice repurposed. The machine is different, but justice and security, the two words that can undo any ideal, are about to pull in opposite directions. Justice arrived, not evenly. A long table, a dozen black robes, microphones that pick up every throat clear. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East opens in late April 1946 inside Ichigaya. in a hall that once belonged to the War Ministry. It runs until November 1948. In the dock, 28 men, politicians, generals, ideologues, accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The head of prosecution is Joseph Keenan. The most famous defendant, former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. On paper, a moral summation. In the room, a duel. There's a day, one of those days witnesses remember years later, when Tojo makes the prosecution look unprepared. Keenan stepped in late for a better prepared junior. Tojo takes the stand. Japan was encircled, the war forced on a nation with no choice. He picks at the seams of aggression, throws shadows of what about toward Western empires. It is natural that a country which has been driven into a corner should try to break out, he tells the court. A woman in the British embassy writes later, Tojo seemed to get the better of Keenan that morning. Another voice cuts through. Justice Radhabinod Pal from India submits a dissent that will echo for decades. Retroactive law. Victors judging. 1,000 pages of no, not adopted, but published. Nationalists will quote it forever. By the end, the ledger is heavy. 25 convictions. 7 men were executed on December 23, 1948, just after midnight in Sugamo prison. Tojo among them. 16 life sentences. 2 defendants died during the proceedings, 1 unfit for trial. The courtroom does its arithmetic, but the arithmetic leaves out 2 columns. First, Unit 731. In Manchuria, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii ran a biological warfare program involving human experimentation. After the war, Ishii and staff aren't dragged to Ichigaya. American intelligence cuts a deal. Immunity for data. Classified. Careers resume. The full story emerges decades later. Second, the tribunal's scope. Allied acts, most controversially the atomic bombings and the fire bombings, sit outside the docket. If you're Chinese, Korean, Filipino, and you see Japanese commanders punished while Allied bombers face no courtroom, victors' justice stops sounding like rhetoric and starts sounding like math. None of this erases the crimes prosecuted. Nanjing, Bataan, the coercive system often referred to as comfort stations. The tribunal records atrocities that could have sunk in silence. But the selective frame bends the story. It seeds grievance, and it tells you about the Cold War ceiling lowering over Tokyo. The Americans need Japan stable, cooperative, and facing forward. A tribunal too long or too deep risks the chaos MacArthur fears. When the executions are carried out in December 1948, China is months from going communist. Korea is a peninsula waiting to explode. The trial meant to close a chapter becomes a footnote to the chapter opening next. Pacifism meets Korea. June 25, 1950. North Korean troops pour across the 38th parallel. Within days, MacArthur's phone lines to Washington are hot. The occupation that said no army needs men to guard docks, depots and rails while American units head to Korea. July 8th. MacArthur orders a national police reserve, 75,000 to start. The name is careful. Police, not army. The function is less coy. Drilled, equipped, organized. The NPR is the spine of a force that doesn't exist on paper. They call them police. They march like soldiers. A Tokyo journalist writes after watching the first recruits drill. Within a few years, the number climbs above 110,000 and the name changes again. Self-Defense Forces. Same uniform, different label. Listen to the policy snap in the money. In 1949, the Dodge Line slams a lid on inflation, fixes the exchange rate at 360 yen to the dollar, forces a balanced budget. Painful. But when Washington starts buying in bulk, the economy can breathe. Special procurements flood in. Truck chassis for military transport. Cotton textiles for uniforms. ship repairs in Yokosuka and Yokohama. In 1951 alone, orders top $500 million. By 1953, the total passes $2 billion. Foundries wake, textile mills hum, shipyards hire. The occupation that broke up the old machine now jumpstarts a new one with steady, subsidized demand. At the same time, SCAP's purges shift aim. The left that surged in lean years, unions swelling, plazas filling, voices like Takuda's, finds the door closing. Communist leaders are purged. Organizers lose platforms. The Red Scare that grips Washington casts its shadow across the Pacific. Look only at economics? Turnaround story. Budgets balanced. Factories busy. Look at the security state? The quiet return of uniforms. Article 9 says no army. A uniformed force stands on parade grounds anyway. The emperor waves as before, now purely decorative. Courts intact. The Diet meets. Reforms real. So is the reversal. Not a return to 1937, something new. A pacifist nation, with a military it says is not a military, protected by an ally whose bases and bombers sit on Japanese soil. Why? Korea, China, Moscow. The occupation's ideals met a decade that would not bend. The result is a compromise. You can draw on a map and photograph from a runway. Freedom returns on a lease. San Francisco, September 8, 1951. Delegations from nearly 50 nations gather in the War Memorial Opera House to sign 2 documents that will hold Japan in a frame for generations. The first ends the war and sets the occupation's clock. The peace treaty restores sovereignty when it enters into force. No reparations bills hollow the treasury. No territorial ambitions granted. Compared to Versailles, generous. Compared to what victims in Asia wanted, forgiving to the point of amnesia. The second, signed the same day in a smaller room with fewer witnesses, is the US-Japan Security Treaty. It permits US bases on Japanese soil for an indefinite period. It allows American forces to be used not only to defend Japan, but to maintain international peace and security in the Far East. Language broad enough to cover almost anything. It binds the alliance. Critics call it a lease on the archipelago. Supporters call it a guarantee against a very bad neighborhood. Not everyone applauds. The Soviet Union refuses to sign. So do Poland and Czechoslovakia. China isn't invited, neither Beijing nor Taipei. In Tokyo, protesters fill the streets. Socialist politicians call the security treaty a betrayal of Article 9, a return to subordination. Placards read, "No bases, no rearmament, true independence." Police form lines, anger real. Votes in the Diet, not close. The treaty will pass. In the middle of this, Shigeru Yoshida signs his name. A career diplomat turned prime minister, his doctrine is simple. Rebuild the economy first, keep defense spending light, let the American alliance underwrite the rest. If you grew up reading samurai stories, this feels like surrender with nicer curtains. If you grew up looking for a city job, it feels like common sense. Growth needs predictability. Predictability needs protection. Protection is cheaper if someone else pays most of the bill. Yoshida knows the bargain is unequal. American forces on Japanese soil operate under their own jurisdiction. Japanese courts can't touch them. The treaty doesn't require the US to defend Japan, only permits bases to exist. But Yoshida also knows the alternatives. Rearm fully and shoulder the cost, or stand unprotected while the Cold War heats next door. He chooses the bases. April 28, 1952. The treaties enter into force. The Allied occupation ends. The flags change. The bases remain. The National Police Reserve isn't a rumor, it's an institution changing its name. The self-defense forces become a fact you can't ignore. Now look at the whole arc we've driven across. The emperor begins as a god, a camera shrinks him, a microphone resets him. The constitution moves sovereignty from myth to people. Women vote. Tenant farmers sign deeds. Boardrooms lose dynastic share charts. A courtroom punishes 7 men with a rope and many more with life, but leaves certain crimes outside its reach. War in Korea slams the gears. A police force becomes a military by another name. A peace treaty ends one occupation by making a security arrangement permanent. If paradox doesn't quite fit, try trade-off. Japan traded a piece of its old sovereignty for a kind of safety and prosperity it couldn't have had in 1952 alone. Admire or resent the choice. You can't deny it. Return to the photograph. The door, the floor, the 2 men standing an arm's length apart. The general who didn't wear a tie. The emperor whose suit didn't fit. That image was an announcement. You have a new order, and we will use your oldest symbol to sell it to you. Now place the treaty pens next to it. The ends of both instruments scratch paper in San Francisco. When the ink dries in April 1952, Japan steps back into sovereignty, pacifist law intact. And yet, on parade grounds and in barracks that don't call themselves barracks, men in uniform form ranks. The National Police Reserve, born at 75,000, stretches past that and slips into a new insignia. The self-defense forces will stand for decades as the country's awkward secret. A military in a pacifist mirror. Does that mean the occupation failed? It means it succeeded under conditions that forced it to bend. It broke the empire without breaking the nation. It rewired the economy without bankrupting it. It constrained the state's capacity for war, while leaving just enough muscle to live under the Cold War's shadow. It did less than some victims needed, and more than many allies expected. The emperor still waves, now a man with a title, and not a god with a command. The factories hum. Farmers own their fields. The courts read a charter drafted by foreigners and ratified by circumstance. The bases hum on islands and peninsulas, and a sentence written in simple language, "Forever renounce war," sits beside a uniform hung on a peg. That is the shape of the change, not a clean line, a loop. The camera that shrank the throne didn't just diminish power, it redirected it, away from a myth and toward a bargain. Japan left the treaty hall a pacifist nation protected by arms. If that sounds like a contradiction, it is. If it sounds like survival, it is that too. Okinawa returns to Japanese administration in 1972. The alliance deepens and strains. Debates over bases, memory, and Article 9 continue. But the Japan that walks out of the treaty hall in April 1952 is the one we've been watching assemble. Peace by contradictory peace.